I want to welcome everyone here this morning. Today is March the 26th. We are in a study of 1 Peter in our study of the general epistles. Certainly hope to see some of you at Memphis School of Preaching lectureship next week. I'll be getting there Monday and having to leave Wednesday after I speak, but hopefully we'll get to see some of you there. We're looking at, we're in chapter 2 of 1 Peter last time when we had to end, looking at verses 4 through 10 of chapter 2 being the church, which is God's spiritual house. And we had looked at, in verse 9, specifically the spiritual house, God's people of verse 5 are now, first, a chosen generation, or that select race, as could be translated. Second, they are a royal priesthood. In verse 5, they were a holy priesthood, here a royal priesthood. Third, they are a holy nation. And fourth, we ended up discussing the holy nation last time. So fourth aspect here is that they are a people, or a peculiar people, which is a people for God's own possession, is the fourth idea that is presented to us. The word peculiar comes from a Latin word which means private property. I sometimes kind of get put out with individuals who will come to this verse and then they will argue strenuously, we're not peculiar in the sense that we're not odd. Webster's New World Dictionary, the college edition that I have, defined this word peculiar in this way, as first, an adjective, one of only one person, things, group, country, etc. Distinctive, exclusive. Two, particular, unique, special, as a peculiar talent for distorting the truth. I'd much rather they had used for keeping the truth there, but the same principle. Third, they go on to say, out of the ordinary, queer, odd, strange. Then in the noun form, one, something belonging to only one as a privilege. Two, a church or parish under a jurisdiction other than that of the diocese in which it is located. This word carried the idea, if you could use this illustration of drawing a circle on a blackboard, or two circles, and put a dot in one of those circles. That dot is peculiar to this circle. It's not peculiar to this circle. In other words, that dot belongs to this circle, not this one. That's the idea that is being expressed with the word peculiar. It is belonging to one. We're dealing with that aspect of it is unique, or it is special to that one. Thus, here are people who belong to God in a special and intimate way. This actually is taken from Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9, where Moses writes for God, know therefore that the Lord thy God, He is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations. God is that faithful God. And in Malachi 3 and verse 17, Malachi refers to them as jewels. When he states, and they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels, and I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him. So they are mine, God says, as jewels. So he calls us jewels. They are in that they are a peculiar treasure belonging only to God. This also suggests the idea of something that is acquired or gained, and includes the idea also of preserving or keeping to oneself. Thus, when we apply that to Christians, Christians are the special, acquired treasure of God, precious jewels that he purposes to keep for himself. And you might compare that what Paul says in Acts 20 and verse 28, that we are bought with a price. Also 1 Corinthians 6 verses 19 and 20. The word people there is from the Greek word laos, from which we get our word laity. Just a quick thing, and you might even answer, how many of you consider yourselves clergy? And then I'll let you say yes or no in the chat room. But this word laos, it is laity, or how we get the word laity, and it very simply means people. You might consider, in regards to that, 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 16, along with Titus 2 and verse 14. We are a peculiar people for God's own possession. We belong to him. We are to separate ourselves thus from the world and the things of the world. There's Lance said, no, he's not clergy. Some of you might be thinking I'm trying to trick you on this, and you might be right about that, because the word clergy comes from the Greek word kleros, which means people. Thus, if you are people, you are part of the clergy. And Howard got that right. No, but I am a priest, and in the Lance added, in the text that the world puts the word, and that would be true. But understand the actual meaning of the word clergy comes from kleros, which means people. It's interesting from that standpoint. So clergy and laity both mean the same thing. It means people. And we are certainly the people of God, and thus priests of God. Now then, the fifth thing that Peter shows about this spiritual house here in this verse is to show the purpose of that spiritual house, or of being that spiritual house. And that is to show or proclaim, to publish abroad the praises of him, God, who hath called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. The idea of show is to proclaim or to publish abroad. The word praises, American Standard has excellencies of God, or of him. And he is the one who has called us out of darkness. You might remember in Colossians 1, verses 12 and 13, that we have been called out of darkness and been translated into the marvelous kingdom of God's own dear Son. And here we have been called out of darkness into his marvelous light. And that would go certainly into a study of 1 John 1, verses 5 through verse 7. The word praises, or American Standard excellencies, is from a Greek word which means virtues or moral excellence. Moral excellence. It is the Greek word arete, if you want the actual Greek term. And it's saying forth, we are to show forth the qualities or the virtues of God. When we look at his qualities, his nature, his love, his mercy, his goodness, his power, his holiness, and he might even specifically mention holiness in this context because of 1 Peter 1, verses 15 and 16, we are to show forth these qualities by reflecting them in our life. And that certainly is the idea behind, for example, Ephesians, the 5th chapter, verses 8 through 10. And what Peter has already said here, in that we lay aside the darkness of sin, here in chapter 2 and verse 1. So we show forth, we proclaim the very nature of God through the life that we live. We reflect those qualities within our life so that others might see that light in us, and they, as Matthew 5:13 through 16 would say, they might glorify God because of the moral excellencies that we are showing forth in our life, or reflecting those qualities and virtues of God. Verse 10, he then says, which in times past were not a people, but now are the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. In times past, these people were not the people of God, but now then they are. This is a quote from Hosea 2 and verse 23 in particular, but you might also consider along that line what he adds in Hosea 1 and verse 6, and Hosea 1 and verse 9, along with Hosea 2 and verse 1. But the quote is from chapter 2 and verse 23 of Hosea. Formerly they had not obtained mercy, but now then they have. Literally, this phrase reads, up to a definite period or definite time, unpitied, but now obtained pity in a single act and a definite time. Now that's being a little bit more explicit than what you would see in an actual translation, but literally that's what it is saying. Up to a definite period or a definite time, unpitied, but now obtain pity in a single act and a definite time. The time that they obtained mercy would have been at their conversion, at their baptism, when they were, as we would find in Romans 6, verse 17 and 18, they were the servants of sin, but they had obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered them, and thus they no longer were the servants of sin in that act of baptism. They then became the servants of righteousness, or going from a state of having no mercy, through that baptism they came into mercy. And that's what Peter is thus affirming here. You were in times past, you were not the people of God, but when you were baptized into Christ, you came into God's mercy. Now then, with that, we enter into the next major section of the book, and that is the obligations of Christians, beginning here at chapter 2 and verse 11, and going through chapter 3 and verse 12. In these obligations as Christians, we have the first section of that dealing with our behavior to the world, verses 11 and verse 12 of chapter 2. He begins by saying, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Christians are to, first, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. The second thing that we're going to see is in verse 12, that we are to have our conversation or manner of life honest or seemingly. But the first thing that he says, Christians are to abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. And he describes us as strangers and pilgrims. Strangers is, an American Standard uses sojourners, and you might go back to chapter 1 and verse 17 in relationship to this word. It's from a word which means one who is a temporary residence. And it is from the Greek word paroikos, one who is a temporary resident. The Christian belongs to a heavenly kingdom. Philippians 3 and verse 20, Paul declares that our citizenship is in heaven, Well, that's the truth of the matter. We are simply a temporary resident here. Then, pilgrim is from a Greek word which means one who remains at a place for a short while, or one who is simply passing through. It is from the Greek word paidemos. So here is a Christian who is a temporary resident of this earth that is just going to be here for a short time because he is passing through this world on his way to his home, which is in heaven. Now then, he admonishes us as a pilgrim and stranger to abstain. The word abstain means literally to hold back from. You hold yourself back from what? Fleshly lust. That is, that word fleshly lust refers to all of the inordinate or evil desires of this world. And you might tie in with that or how John describes it in 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And that's specifically in verse 16, but that entire section there. The fleshly lust and submission to those would lead us into a preoccupation with the world and away from the things of God. Our citizenship is in heaven. Our affections are to be in heaven. We are to be the friend of God, not the friend of the world. And thus, a preoccupation with the world and the things of the world, the fleshly lust of the world, will take us away from those spiritual matters and our minds centering along Jesus Christ and the things of God. Thus, these things war against the soul. That is, they war, and it shows that the word war there shows an aggressive conflict which must ever be resisted. And a good discussion of this would be in Galatians, the 5th chapter, and starting in about verse 16 and going through verse 24, and then described very well that in Galatians the 6th chapter, verse 7 and verse 8, that those who sow to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, and chapter 1 and verse 14 of Peter here. So these are warring against. There is an aggressive conflict that we're in with the fleshly lust, and we've got to hold ourselves back from those things. It would be easy, and it is easy, let's face it, to get close to those things of the world. And Peter is saying, you hold yourself back from them. Second thing that we are to have as Christians is that we are to have our conversation, verse 12, or manner of life, honest among the Gentiles. Having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. The word conversation there is, American Standard says, behavior. It deals with our manner of life. And I kind of like, personally, the word conversation. I know that it does not express the exact idea to the mind of man today, except from the standpoint of the aspect that it is saying that our life says something to others. And that's very true, that aspect of it. And so it is a conversation, yes, it is our manner of life saying things to others. Our conversation, thus, our manner of life, or our behavior is to be honest. The American Standard says seemly. It's from the Greek word kalos, meaning beautiful. It describes a lovely conduct, a conduct that is admirable by or to others. Thus they were to have an honest, a lovely conduct or manner of life among the Gentiles. Here the word Gentiles is not being used of those who are Gentiles as opposed to Jews physically speaking. It is Gentiles in relationship to those who are not the people of God. You have the heathen. They are the ones who are the Gentiles, as opposed to the people of God would be in that spiritual relationship, spiritual Israel. Well, thus the Gentiles, those individuals, the heathen world, those who are not Christians, they see that good, that lovely conduct of Christians. And those who had not been converted, the heathen or the Gentile here, would speak against you as evildoers. The word speak against, there's often the word blaspheme, which is blasphemos, to speak against, and translated properly to speak against. Here, though, it is the Greek word katalousin, and it means literally to speak down. It's the prefix kata, and then the root word laleo, and laleo is to speak, and kata is down, thus to speak down, or down to speak. This was especially true in the first century, that the heathen would speak down in regards to Christians. Christians were being charged as disturbers of the peace. You might remember that which is at least partially brought about this letter, 1 Peter, is that Nero had burned Rome, and he laid the blame at Christians. Well, thus they were being charged as disturbers of the peace. They were charged with interfering with trade, being superstitious, belonging to an illegal religion, refusing to worship the images of the gods. They were being charged with things such as cannibalism and incest. If anything bad happened during that time, whether it be an earthquake, pestilence, drought, didn't matter what it was, Christians were being charged with it. Now then, what Peter is saying here, these accusations that these heathen are making against you as Christians are going to be proved false by your good conduct of life, your lovely manner of life. And thus, they shall behold, or they shall glorify God in the day of visitation, because of these good works, this lovely life that they see you doing. The word by there, where it says by your good works, is literally the word ek, and it means out from within. So it is literally out from within your good works. And again, this is the good there is the Greek word kalos, which deals with beautiful or lovely, and thus their deeds are lovely. Out from within your beautiful deeds, they're going to glorify God. Your beautiful deeds, the reason and the design that we live the type of life and we perform the beautiful deeds that we do is for others to glorify God. Matthew 5, verses 14 through 16 again. We come to this phrase, though, day of visitation. What is meant by this day of visitation? It's interesting, and I'm going to quote what Guy and Wood states on it primarily. But the Greek word that's translated visitation here is from the Greek word episkope, which deals with oversight. And Guy and Wood states about this phrase, and it is a rather lengthy quote, but I think worthy of consideration here and to help us in our understanding, states that the day of the phrase day of visitation with slight variation occurs in Luke 19:44. Visitation, Greek episkopos, is derived from the same source from which our words bishop and overseer come. Peter's use of the phrase was doubtless prompted by his remembrance of the Lord's use thereof. Because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation, Luke 19:44, where it is applied to the time when God comes to oversee his people, not only to rebuke them, but to bring them, if possible, to repentance. And such appears to be its meaning here, expanded to include his coming in providence to all men, and in all the ways in which his gracious influences wrought upon the world of mankind. It was thus the expressed hope of Peter that the godly conduct of the disciples to whom he wrote would be the means of influence for good in inducing many of the unbelievers who had formerly been their traducers and accusers to turn to God in penitence as they learned more and more of the salvation which had been vouchsafed to men. The context and the similarity which obtains between this phrase and the Lord's use of it prompts us to conclude that the visitation here was a coming in grace rather than of judgment, as the term sometimes means. See Luke 1:68 and 7:12. Though God visits men with judgment, he also visits them with salvation. Psalm 106 and verse 4, and that's the end of the quote. And so I think that's right here. God is visiting men with grace here, with a lovely aspect of life. And through that lovely aspect of our life, they are brought to repentance. So that's our behavior in relationship to the world. Now then, the next section of the Christian's obligations is our behavior to government. Chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. He starts in verse 13, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme," and might as well get this first part, "or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him," and we'll stop at that. Christians are to submit to every ordinance of man. The word submit here means to be to subject or to be obedient to. Here, the context of submit yourselves to every ordinance of man, he's dealing with civil government. Notice that Peter does not mention the form or the type of government that he's dealing with. Whether it be a democracy, a monarchy, totalitarianism, doesn't make any difference. Does not make any difference. Doesn't matter the type of government that one is dealing with, he is to submit himself to it. Notice also that Peter does not mention whether this government is good or evil, because it really does not matter. Our obligation is the same. Also, you can study Romans, the 13th chapter, in particular verse 1 along this line, but that entire section's starting there. It is, to a great extent, parallel to what Peter is writing here. Notice, though, that in going back to whether this government is good or evil, some individuals or Christians have wanted to make this applicable only to the aspect of good government. And if a government is evil or doing evil things, then supposedly we as Christians have the right to rebel against that government and not obey it. But that's not what is being set forth here. There's no discussion whether it's good or evil. Our obligation is the same. If you go back to the time in which Paul wrote Romans 13, And here Peter, writing this, we've already stated, in relationship to the aspect of the purpose of this letter, was that here's Christians who are going to be undergoing great physical persecution for being a Christian. And that Nero had burned Rome. He had laid the blame at the feet of Christians, now then going to bring about this great persecution. And Peter says, of that government, you submit yourselves to it. Was it an evil government? Absolutely. Was it doing what was wrong? Absolutely. Yet Peter and Paul's command in relationship to both situations there, both of them dealing with Rome and Nero being the ruler of Rome at the time, you submit to them. You obey them because they are the Lord's anointed. And so we submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. We obey government because we're Christians. That is, because God has commanded us to be obedient to them. And when we obey the government in that regard, God's name is honored as the leader of those rendering such service. I'm obeying God because I'm obeying the government because I'm a Christian. And how can look back at this? They were going to be undergoing persecution, and what he has just stated is here's individuals who are going to be speaking down at Christians. Now then, they need to behold your good behavior. Part of that good or lovely behavior is the submitting ourselves to government authorities. Now then, we would add, I'll mention this again, but it would be good to add here, the only time in which a Christian has a right to disobey the government is when the government makes a law that is contradictory to God's law. If God says something and government says, you can't do this, then man has to obey God rather than man. Or the Christian has to obey God rather than man in that situation. But even then, he does not have the right to disregard any of the other laws that government has made. He must submit himself to the rest of those laws, even though he might not be able to keep that one law. Now then, verse 14, he sets forth the purpose of government. And basically, he sets forth two things. When he says, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. So the purpose of government, twofold. First, to punish evildoers. Second, to praise those who do well. This is also stated in Romans 13th chapter, verses 3 and verse 4. I say these passages are to a great extent parallel. It is right in that purpose of government, and Paul sets this forth in Romans 13 and specifically verse 4, in the punishment of evildoers, and I'll add this, to put to death those individuals who are not doing right. Those individuals who are evildoers, the government has the responsibility given by God to put those individuals to death. He beareth not the sword in vain, that is, the government bears not the sword in vain, Romans 13 verse 4. The sword was an instrument of death. Therefore, the government is in that punishment of evildoers to execute those individuals who are evildoers. Our nation needs to take heed to that, and we get into a lot of arguments a lot of times as to whether or not capital punishment works. Well, yes, I know that it does work. Number one, because God says that it does, and number two, I know that individual who's executed is never going to commit another crime. And so it works, if nothing else, from that standpoint, but it also works as a deterrent to crime. Now then, the problem is, does capital punishment as practiced in the United States work? Well, that's a different matter. I mean, look at, what's his name, Scott Peterson, that was just sentenced. And some are always saying, with all of the legal appeals and everything else, he was sentenced to death, but he might live out his life, his entire life, in jail, simply because of all of the appeals and everything else it's going to go. Generally speaking, person waits 12 to 15 years on death row before they're executed. Well, it needs to be done speedily. And when it's not done speedily, then the people's heart are set to do evil, Solomon says. Well, it needs to be the government has a responsibility and obligation to punish evildoers, and also praise those who do well. Both of those are aspects that need to be taken. Let me also, and this doesn't deal specifically with the aspect of government, but in relationship to children. Our children and we as parents need to learn both of those principles. A lot of times we as parents get to the point where we think just the punishment of an evil action or an action that is wrong by our children is the type of discipline that is necessary. Well, when we get to that point, then we've lost sight of what true discipline is. Discipline, yes, includes that punishment of that action that is wrong, but it also includes the praise of doing good. And a lot of times parents forget that aspect, and they center upon the punishment aspect without the praise aspect. And when that happens, then children are going to grow up being warped in their thinking and in their actions. We need to do both, even as God does both. Now then, verse 15 sets forth the reason for our submission. As far as what Peter is setting forth here, when he says, "For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish man." The reason for our submission is to put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. By the Christian's submission and by his good deeds that he's doing, his lovely manner of life, they will put to silence. The word silence is from a Greek word which literally means to muzzle. It is a Greek word themoo. You're going to muzzle their speech. You're going to muzzle them. Put to silence those false accusations that are against you. Verse 16, "As free, and not using your liberty as a cloak, or for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God." Here there's a caution that's being given. The Christian's freedom is a caution now. As free, you are free. Galatians 5 in verse 1 sets forth we are free as well. Many passages set forth our freedom. We are free from sin, for example, as a Christian. Those in the world are subject to sin and the slaves of sin. We're free from the law of Moses. We are free from fear. We are free from a lot of aspects. We cannot, though, allow that freedom to be used to live wicked lives. And thus that freedom is not the grounds for fleshly indulgences. Maliciousness is from a Greek word kakia, which literally means evil, or as American Standard translates it, wickedness. Maliciousness, evil, wickedness, however you want to express it, the Christian's freedom is not freedom, or that freedom is not grounds for that type of wickedness, that type of evil. The word cloak is from a word which means veil or covering. You cannot use this as a covering for evil, for wickedness. Instead, they are servants of God. The word servant is from the Greek word doulos, which literally means a slave. These Christians cannot use their freedom as a covering for evil. Instead, they are the slaves of God. A slave is one who loses his own identity for his master. Thus, here he is, a Christian. What is it? He's lost his identity for God. He has no will of his own. The will of God is our will. We take on his attitude. Everything else. So they are, instead, servants of God, slaves of God. And thus we live in the way that God wants us to. Now then, verse 17, he closes this section with 4 admonitions. First, honor all men. Second, love the brotherhood. Third, fear God. Fourth, honor the king. First, honor all men. In other words, we are to give everyone the respect they deserve as being created in God's image. Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27 mentions that we are created in the very image of God. And thus, as being created in the image of God, in His likeness, we deserve honor or respect. And you might compare Philippians 2, verse 3, Ephesians 5:21, and 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. Should also have mentioned, probably in that regard, James, the 2nd chapter, in relation, or the 3rd chapter in that relationship, and what we studied in relationship to blessing God with our tongue and cursing man who is made in the likeness of God. And he says these things ought not so to be. What is it? We honor all men. Second, love the brotherhood. The word love here is from the Greek word agapao. And thus it is a serving love, a love which gives, a love which does that which is best for others. Brotherhood here, love the brotherhood, would refer to the church in general. We recognize that we have the church universal. We also have the church locally. And that locally can be within an area or within a city or congregation. Here, the church universal, love the brotherhood, all Christians. And while each congregation we realize is a separate entity, and we are members of a specific congregation, like I am a member of the Bellevue Church of Christ, well, we must not lose sight of the church as a whole as also. And I think that certainly is what Jesus is talking about in relationship to our love one toward another in John 13, verse 34 and 35. So love the brotherhood as a whole. The third admonition, fear God. The word fear here is the Greek word phobio. And certainly we recognize the phobia, which we use, phobia. That's the idea being expressed here. Fear God. It's applied in 2 ways in the Scriptures. It's applied or used first in relationship to being afraid. And certainly Jesus sets forth that aspect of being afraid in Matthew the 10th chapter and verse 28, when he says to fear not those who are able to kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And then second, it's used in relationship to having the proper respect and reverence for God, and certainly Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, that fear God and keep His commandments. What is it? That have the proper respect, the proper reverence for God, that it would cause us to keep His commandments. Then the fourth admonition, honor the king. The word honor is the same word, in relationship to honor all men. It's the Greek word tamao, and that is, we are to show the king here, and here king would represent governmental authorities, all governmental authorities, the proper respect that they deserve as being servants of God. They are God's servants here upon this earth, even as we as Christians are servants of God. Now, they might rebel against what they are supposed to do as the servants of God, but God has authorized governments. He is the one who sets them up, who brings them down. The book of Daniel deals with that to a great extent. And again, we would mention that the only time that we have the right to disobey governmental authorities is when they make a specific law which contradicts God's law. And then we would only have the right to disrespect or to disobey that one specific law, not government as a whole. Thus, the Christian's responsibility to government. The next section as to Christian obligations would be servants to masters. Wish we had time, and I will encourage you to read these passages along with what we see here in chapter 2, verses 18 through 25 of servants to masters. But read Ephesians 6 chapter, verses 5 through 9, Colossians 3:22, and 1 Timothy 6, verses 1 and 2, along with this, because what Paul writes in those passages is parallel with what Peter writes here. Verse 18, he starts out, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. Servant, we mentioned the word servant back in verse 16 as being the word doulos, and it means a slave, that we are slaves of God, doulos there. That's not the word that's servant, that's translated servant here. The word servant here is from the Greek word oiketai, and it literally means a house slave. It is probably being used typically of all slaves here, but it literally is a house slave, someone who is a slave that would work in the house. Now then, they were to subject themselves to their masters with all fear. The word subject here is the Greek word hupotasso, and it is a military term which literally is to arrange under. So you arrange yourself under your master. The word master is a Greek word, despotes, and we get our word despot from this word, despotes. So, you servants, you arrange yourself under your despots, is literally the word that's used here. And then, with all fear, the word fear again is the Greek word phobos. They were to not only fear their earthly masters, and certainly the punishment that they could bring as being their earthly masters, but also as a result, they were to fear God as well. And that takes us back to verse 13, verse 15, verse 16, and 17. They were to submit themselves, to arrange themselves under these despots. Notice that they were, and he goes on to say, to submit themselves both to the gentle, the good and gentle, but also the froward. The word good is from the Greek word agathos, and this is a word, as opposed to kalos, which we've been noticing previously, as dealing with a beautiful life. This word agathos has the aspect of inner goodness or kindness of heart. So here is someone who has an inner goodness of them. They are good from that standpoint. They have a kindness of heart. And he also says gentle. This is a word which deals with one who is mild and considerate. Now then, in relationship to a slave, or whether you're dealing with a house slave or another type of slave, and their master, it would be, we would say, fairly simple as a slave to submit ourselves or to arrange ourselves under someone who had this type of an attitude, who had an inner goodness and kindness of heart and was mild and considerate in his dealings with his slaves. That individual would be, certainly, easy to serve. But what about the one who's not that way? The word froward that's translated here is from a Greek word which, it's scolios, and is literally crooked or perverse is the American standard. We might recognize scolios from the aspect of bones getting crooked, and it's scoliosis there, scolios, crooked, perverse. Now that individual who would be crooked, who would be perverse in his dealings with his slaves, that individual would not be so easy to serve. And he says, do not rebel against your masters. Even if they are have this type of an attitude of being crooked and perverse in their dealings with you. You might be honest, you might be doing what you're supposed to do, but here's that master who is crooked or perverse in his dealings with you. You don't rebel against your masters simply because you're free spiritually. Verse 16 does not mean that you can seek your freedom from slavery. And this type of service or this type of submission brings God's grace or favor. Well, our time is up for this hour, so we'll pause here and